I just want to quickly thank Ellen for her role. She's been one of the senior scholars for the Financial Literacy Research Consortium and leading her expertise, all on a volunteer basis, I have to note. So has been tremendous, has come out to a number of our events and been workshop speaker. And so thank you, Ellen, for all that you've done for our initiative. Really appreciate it. Okay, so my job is here is to talk a little bit about why we do focus groups in general. As I look around the audience, I realize this, earlier today I talked a little about selection effects. That's probably what we have here. Everybody here probably already believes that focus groups are a good idea, and that's why you're here. But in some ways, I come at this topic because when we first started this work, I had to really defend why we were doing focus groups, especially, no offense to any economists in the audience, but people who are used to more quantitative methods tend to say, why are you bothering with these focus groups? Why are you talking to people? That's just ridiculous. We don't need to do that. We can just look at the numbers and we'll tell you what people do. And so I'm not saying this is a world of haves and have-nots, but I think that it's important to understand this. So in some ways, what I'm going to do is just defend the fact that focus groups are important. Much of which you already know. So what is a focus group? It's a process of gathering information. It's no different than the surveys or anything else that you see in quantitative work. But it's qualitative because we spend a lot of time in the process of the collection. And it's really a group interview. Ultimately, it's a skilled facilitator doing a group interview. It generates a lot of data. Unlike a survey question where you answer yes or no, or you check a box in a different bracket, you talk about it. And we use the way you talk about it as some of that data. Oftentimes this is done individually, so individual interviews, and you'll see work like that, but a focus group is more collectively. I would say more and more in the field of policy analysis we see focus groups, sometimes at the beginning of a project to understand a topic or maybe later to understand some of the results. But it's part of what we're doing. It has a long history in marketing. Going back to the 50s and earlier, to the 30s, there's some early literature in this area, communication, sociology, education. A lot of folks do this. I think there's probably been some bias against qualitative in various sectors and disciplines, but we're doing our best to bring it back. So I want to just pitch this as a complement, not a substitute, a complement to quantitative research. Why is it important? Because it gives you more research insights. A survey is pretty narrow. It can give you a lot, but in a focused way. Focus groups, it's more like the scatter shot. We can get a lot of information on a topic. We can start to triangulate. So we find some things from a survey, and then we can test them out in a focus group, and we can kind of get narrower in. And I think it helps with validity issues. Is the kind of things that we're measuring in these surveys, are the things we're measuring in these surveys really valid or not? It can also be very exploratory, and that's much of the way we approached them this first year with the FLRC and our work at Wisconsin, is to try to understand what are good research questions. We didn't know enough about some of these to even have articulate research questions. So what we did is a series of focus groups to understand financial literacy issues for vulnerable populations. We're looking at teachable moments. We're looking at the context in which people are making decisions, what financial advice they get, who they get it from, who do they trust, who do they not trust. We wanted to gain a lot of insight from personal experiences, so we looked at people in public programs who are going through a foreclosure, who are going through a job program to get back in the job force, who are going through a match savings program. People are sort of in the moment of those kinds of programs. And we also wanted to get at some of the emotional stuff, the affective stuff about what people are at. The idea here was really just to again, go over the landscape and to get a sense of what we might do with further work. And in some cases, it helped inform survey research questions and other kind of work like that. We did 26 focus groups in the last federal fiscal year. The goals were to explore how people learned, where people learned, and we focused on people who were lower income, minorities, people with disabilities, and their caregivers. If you attended the session before lunch, the Jennifer Turnham from Apps Associates, she presented some of the results on some of those focus groups, particularly with people who are involved in public programs and thinking about teachable moments in those public programs. We also did some work with people with disabilities and their caregivers, so parents whose children were aging out of the school system, those kinds of programs. Here you can see a list of some of the programs, so VITA tax sites, IDA match savings programs, employment services, people in counseling programs, and these were all over the country. They weren't just in Wisconsin. Small business development. We did 3 focus groups with Spanish-speaking employers and employees in the Orange County area. And then we did some focus groups with employees of a large logistics center who weren't involved in any kind of program as sort of a comparison group. So you can see some of the cities and where we were located. So as you think about the methodology of focus groups, you have to think about who you're selecting. Focus groups are generally not generalizable. So in other words, I'm not picking this group to represent the American public. I'm picking this group to dive in deep and to get some more information. So we use mailing lists of community-based organizations to recruit people. That's how we wanted to get people, and from one employer. We chose about 30 clients sort of randomly, and we did a letter to them saying, will you participate in this? And then if you want to, then you can call 1-800 number to opt in to the focus group. This was a very important process for us because we have to go through Human Subjects Protection, Institutional Review Board, IRB. They were really worried about people being coerced into these groups to reveal all of their financial secrets to their peers. And they were very, very concerned about this. So we had to go through a very rigorous process to recruit them so that there was no pressure on them. It was them opting into these kinds of things. They did receive a cash award, a gift card. We learned a lot about how to do and not do that. Typically, we'd confirm 8 to 10 people, and 6 to 8 would show up. So you can see there's lots of places where you get some distortion about who's going to show up in the room, right? You randomly select them, and then some agree, and then some show up. So there's lots of ways this happens. We use first names only in the sessions. The session's always open with some ground rules, including that everything you say here is going to be confidential, and we're not going to use first names, and you shouldn't use first names of each other, and everything stays in the room, that kind of thing. The transcriptions, we recorded everything and then had written transcriptions. They used pseudonyms, so there was no way to track it back to the person. All of the transcripts were coded by 3 different people, so we could compare, so people would code and say, well, this person was talking about this topic, and they'd give it a code, and then somebody else would say, no, I think it's about this topic, and then we'd have to reconcile. We also had somebody there taking notes about body language. Were people talking like this, or were they talking like this? Or, what was sort of the context in which they were taking? Were they being sheepish? Were they being aggressive? Were they being anxious? Those kinds of things. The coding, we use a software called NVivo. You may hear other people talk about other software. There's lots of software out there. But basically, it allows to come up with a coding system where you say, OK, here's a bunch of what people talked about these things, and then we're going to group those things into these larger categories, and we're going to group those categories into other categories. And we can kind of massage the data to try to figure out, well, what are the threads of conversations across these different groups, and how do these topics sort of pull out? And then typically what we would do is sort of analyze that. We'd look at it, we'd talk about it, and then we'd figure out what the patterns were. And then we'd highlight particular passages, particular quotes from particular people, which we wouldn't name, their actual names. But then we'd say, this is kind of representative of this class of comments that people made, this category of comments. They're generalizable, but they're illustrative. They tell us something about the general trends that we see. So just some themes that we saw in the data, and you'll hear about more of these in the other sessions. But we learned a lot about how people really rely on local media, especially call radio, and print, even the print news stuff. People really rely on that as a source of information. They recognize it and use it. In the employment context, we hear a lot about financial education for low-income employees of employers. They have a lot of conflict over that. They don't trust their employer. Anything that reduces their paycheck, they're suspicious about. Is it going to him? Is it going to me? What's going on? So there's a lot of conflict about how you could do it in the workplace. The issue of managing credit cards and understanding credit cards is a big topic. Managing debt. A lot of discussion about kids. That I'm willing to cut my budget back, but I don't want to cut my kids' baseball. So there's a limit to how much people will pare back. And a lot of distrust of banks. And I remember we did this in fiscal year 2010. So the news was not particularly enhancing banks' reputation among this population. But we didn't hear, well, I'm afraid they're going to fail, or we didn't hear anything about the stimulus or the TARP or whatever. It was more like the fees. I don't know when these fees are going to hit me. They seem sort of capricious. They seem kind of random. I don't like the fees. So some of that discussion. Other themes we heard is that with the low income, I just can't save. That's just impossible. But a lot of interest in being thrifty. How do I cut corners? How do I get by with less as a way to cut corners and make cost? A lot of focus on behavior, not education. So people didn't necessarily want to learn about how things work. They wanted to know how to do things, right? So give me tips, give me skills, as opposed to understanding APR or something like that. And most people said they wanted one-on-one work. They didn't want to do group work. They wanted to do one-on-one work. So looking ahead, I'm in part here to preach to the converted, which is that focus groups are a good tool. And we're going to continue to use them in our work this year, looking at the Savers Credit, looking at some of our assessment of counseling and education. I think we've learned, we can learn more from these focus groups, not just about how we deliver financial education, but also how we as researchers communicate the results. And we're actually doing trainings now with our researchers so that they can better interact with reporters in the media. because we know how important it is to get it out to especially local media, to be a good presence. Most academics are terrible at particularly call-in shows and that kind of thing, so helping them understand a little bit better. And then just thinking about these teachable moments and working through these behavioral issues, thinking about employers as a way we might be able to do it in a more trusting context, so online or maybe divorced from the HR department in some way. And then also first-time homebuyers would be another market that we've looked at a little bit. So with that, I'll end and we can talk more.